Hi everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. I'm Philip Ideson, and I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement, and I'm delighted to be joined to help me facilitate today's conversation by my co-founder and partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Hey Kelly, welcome to the webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know it's into January, but I feel like it's our first live event of the year. So we still get to say Happy New Year. Thank you for being back and helping us kick off 2024 in a very spectacular way.
Yeah, and you look a little bit more wrapped up in Boston, Massachusetts than I am here in Orlando, Florida, here in January as well.
And what you can't see is the wool blanket down here making the lightweight logo top possible.
Well, if you haven't joined an AOP Live before, the format is, it's really all about questions that we've pulled together for our guests today around the topic of today's webinar, but also we want to hear from you as we go through the conversation. So there's a couple of ways for you to do that within the event technology. You can see in the sidebar on your right-hand side, there's either a Q&A area or there's a chat area. And both Kelly and I are going to be monitoring that as we go through the conversation. So please don't be shy. We will pose as many questions as we have the opportunity to over the next 45 minutes or so to our guests. Now, the topic today, the title of it is Driving the Best Business Outcomes from IT Providers. So I think we've been focused a lot on InfoSec when it comes to managing software over the last few years, but cost is definitely becoming, if it didn't go away in the first place, it's definitely coming to the fore here in 2024. So how can we balance kind of those operational requirements around software and the cost expectations this year? We're going to be joined by Logan Furbee. Logan is a senior SaaS consultant at Vendr. She's been with Vendr since 2021, but's negotiated hundreds of SaaS contracts in that time. So she's going to share a little bit of the lay of the land on where we are in terms of pricing, where we are in trends, what can we do about it when it comes to our SaaS spend this year. So with that being said, let's bring Logan out on stage. Hey, Logan.
Hello.
Great for you to join us. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today.
I'm honored to be a part of this conversation.
We already had a great kind of chat backstage before we went live. So really looking forward to today's chat. And, there's something that we always ask all of our guests right at the very beginning, just to give a little bit more context into your background is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Oh, I love that question. So I would say a bit of both, but I do think procurement found me. I was in SaaS sales before coming over to the more of like the procurement side of things. Yeah. And I had an old coworker reach out and say, I think you'd be perfect for this. It's relationship based. You're still dealing in contracts and, growth, but it's a different angle to it. So I made the switch and best change ever in my career.
Now, when you came over from you obviously had perceptions of procurement when you were a salesperson. How did the reality match with those perceptions when you went onto the other side of the table?
There's so much more involved with every review than I ever had any idea about. I always wondered when I wanted a contract completed, why it would take so long in legal and security and why there are steps in place. And now I understand. And now I push for many more eyes on these contracts just to make sure nothing slips through the cracks.
Yeah, it's funny as well. Sometimes when we brought up as adversaries between procurement and sales sometimes, and I don't think we like to admit it sometimes, but the skill set is so similar between the two of them. At the end of the day, I mean, we may be on different sides of the table, but I think we're very similar in terms of what the role is, the personality traits that are needed. You talked about relationships. That's so key for a procurement person.
Oh yeah. Even some of the same conversations, same contract, if you have rapport within the individuals, it's just friendlier and you want to help out more. So it does make a huge difference to build that relationship.
So let's go into, the start of every, in fact, in advance of each one of our AOP lives, we actually survey our community on a question that's related to the topic of conversation today. And so let's bring up the question that we asked the Art of Procurement community beforehand. And I'm going to read this out in case there's anybody that's listening that isn't actually watching directly the screen. So the question that we asked was, what is the top source of IT spend leakage or waste that procurement will have to contend with in 2024? And the number one answer was unused licenses. Nearly half of our respondents said that that's the top source of spend leakage. The second was redundant solutions at 38%. Then we had shadow IT spend at 16% and other at 6%. So overwhelmingly, between unused licenses and redundant solutions being the top two. I'll just pause a moment, Logan, just to get your reaction to those numbers and whether that's anything that kind of ties with what you're seeing or if there's any surprises there.
Oh my gosh. Unused licenses is definitely one of the first things we discuss when I'm talking to a supplier about a customer's contract.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these companies experienced incredible growth, especially in the COVID phase, and a lot more things were done online. And so there was so much growth. They just were spending a lot of the money that they, were gifted.
Yep.
And now when the economy is a lot more volatile, we're starting to see that so many of these licenses have not been used, redundant solutions where so much overlap. So these are key ones where you're having to clean up internally to make sure you're not just wasting budget, and then you can allocate that budget to other solutions.
What's the root cause of that typically? Is it, the majority of stakeholders having the ability to go and buy whatever they want, essentially?
Yeah, there's not always checks and balances. And so people just signing contracts without truly reviewing the language and ensuring that the numbers match up with employee count or user count. And so, yeah, just ensuring that there are some levels of approvals in step so that you can't sign without your CFO signing off or, just somebody else reviewing it for you.
Yeah, I think that demand management in software, we don't think about that as much as we do on the goods side of things. Excuse me. And yet, when it comes to software, it's probably the biggest opportunity for most immediate cost reduction. So I just wonder if you could give any advice about, to an organization that perhaps doesn't do much in terms of really understanding their licenses and where they are and what they use and what they don't use, or even what they have over-specified. They're using something that's the platinum tier when they need the silver tier. Where do you go about even starting to understand what that might look like and what the opportunity may be?
Yeah, and that can seem like an overwhelming process. So my recommendation would be to really think about what you want the next year to look like. So what are your top priorities? And then just go off of those top priorities on what solutions you need to support those priorities, and then dig into those contracts and that spend and figure out, okay, what tier do we actually need? How many licenses do we need? Do we need support here? And really digging into those top contracts and just kind of going down the priority list. Another way you could do it is your spend, if whatever you're spending the most on, review those 10 contracts and see, how can I remove a line item that's 20,000 right there a year? Or, just making sure everything's as clean as possible so that you're truly supporting your priorities, but you're not spending where it's not used.
From a data perspective, I think that we're often wary of going to suppliers because we want, by doing so, shows some weakness. Like, we don't have this information ourselves. We're going to you and asking you for the information that we can then go and use against you in a negotiation later. Any tips on where to get the information from and the data from? Or is it okay to go and ask your supplier, can you provide me this breakdown of where all my licenses stand? It's
like the supplier's job to provide that information. And if you find out that it was fudged at all, then that's a huge legal case. So it behooves that supplier to give you accurate information, correct data. And even if you wanted to CC a couple levels in that company, just to make sure that it's as transparent as possible, I would advise to not just go to your sales rep, but perhaps go to the sales rep and their manager, just to make sure it's as honest as possible and nobody has the opportunity to fudge any of the details.
Yeah. Have you seen that then? If it's something to be aware of, I'm guessing that's coming from experience, that you may have seen data that is not wholly accurate.
It's not even, I think a lot of times people don't know the data, and sometimes the sales reps haven't even checked for updates. I have seen a lot of terms that they didn't want to honor the auto renewal removal, or they didn't want to, honor, you have 60 days to get out of a contract, or if you don't do this, you can get out. So I've seen more of the term language not be provided, or them not be clear on, but the data, I'm not even sure some suppliers know the data without really digging in. But like I said, it's it's really their responsibility to provide that information so that it can be as honest of a partnership as possible.
Now, we just got a question from Jamie. So I'll pose this to you. Jamie says, if you request the license information from the supplier, are you more likely to run into the risk of an audit? And great question, Jamie.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I like to think of these conversations as it's better for the truth to be out there in the long run. So if you have been using, let's say, 20 licenses and not been charged on them, yes, you can get away with that for another year, but I think that it's better to spend on what you're actually using and take that risk. So I would advise to just request that information. And if there is an audit, then you can work with them. And if you're experiencing great growth, economies of scale discounting, like you can really pull on that lever to bring pricing down. So I never think it's bad to be really honest with it.
Yeah, transparency on both sides. One of the things we wanted to talk about today was pricing, and kind of where we are, what the trends are in 2024. What's driving the increased cost that's associated with so much of the software today? We're seeing lots of cost increases that are being pushed on us. A lot of times it's really difficult to counter against those. You kind of got to take it depending on what the software is, who you are, what the context is. What's behind that?
Many things. So obviously, like I mentioned, volatile economy, that never helps with the foundation of the success of any company, but especially in the tech landscape, or a ton of different industries, there are a lot of companies per sector. So we've seen a lot more competitors out there. So that means retention is going down for a ton of companies. And that is almost fear-based for the increase to go. If you want to keep any of your employees, you are trying to justify increasing the cost of your solutions or your, what you're bringing to market. So I think it's just a mix of things, but it's like a perfect storm right now. And we're seeing that in obviously the end of 2023 and definitely the start of 2024.
Yeah. What kind of pushback or justification do you typically get from software companies because you can push back and say, well, your marginal cost of providing that software at this point to me is relatively minimal. So why should I be taking a 20% or a 50% cost increase? And I'm sure you get lots of objections back from that. And, when you're on the sales side, you probably did it yourself. I'd imagine to a lot of buyers pushing back on cost increase requests. So what are some of the reasonings that are given for why now? And, why we don't really have a choice to an opportunity or willingness to negotiate it?
Yeah. So I think sometimes the prettier response is there's a lot more value now. We've added new elements to the solution. We are growing, so that's trickling down to what you're experiencing. And that's just the cost of surviving. So I don't think you should be, I don't think that should allow your annual spend to go up, but that's definitely one pushback I receive. Standard increase is 10 to 15%. Well, that's not accurate, but you can kind of say anything, and it's starting to become more standard for 10%, but they're starting to really fall on that justification. And that's an opportunity to push back because it's still, I think, more likely to be 5 to 7%, which is still high, but not 10 or more. Let's see, what other pushbacks? Really just a really firm stance. They have numbers that they want to hit. And so I will say I'm seeing a lot more pushback and consistent. And so these negotiations are taking 3 to 4 rounds, whereas they used to take like 1 to 2. And you're having to bring the CFO in to really say, like, it's either a decrease or we can't continue with you. And, that's heartbreaking, but it's good to get that, like we said, that honest conversation on the table.
Do you find that perhaps it's a harder environment for a lot of the tech companies themselves who are providing the software are in high growth mode? The environment around funding and accessibility of, investment and interest rates, do you feel that plays into it as well? There isn't necessarily that free money, let's say, and I use that term very loosely, but there isn't the money to invest in customer growth that there may have been before, which allowed them to be probably a little bit more open on pricing. And now there's a lot more rigidity because, you have to make money. And so kind of gone are the days where you can buy customers quite so much.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Not only is that an issue? But like you are having to, a lot of these companies are going through layoffs. So you don't even have that support for your customers. So it's very difficult to not only go out and find new customers or even entice them to come on, but then you can't fully support them. So then that retention is really poor. So yeah, it's a very interesting cycle right now.
It's kind of on this topic. I'm looking at some questions that are coming in. A question from, let's see, from Christine. As we move to more SaaS solutions, the vendors seem to know how difficult it is for us to change solutions, and they're becoming very aggressive with pricing. How do we defend against this when the software is now entrenched, and so there's a huge cost to change, and the software provider knows that?
Yeah. So with this question, I mean, there are a couple avenues. So either if you want to move to a different vendor, then you have every right to request them to pay out your contract or to financially support that implementation and that transition, because it's not only going to take money, it's going to take resources, it's going to take time, and it's going to take a stall in your objectives because you're focused right now on that implementation. So you have every right to use that in the commercial review.
Yeah, with the new provider or the potential new provider.
Right. But if you wanted to stay and you feel like you have to stay, like you are forced to remain because it's so difficult, I would just it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And so I do think a lot of financial teams are looking at big picture and they're thinking we can spend $200,000 with this one group, or we can invest one time to move over, but we're going to save $75,000 every year. And, after a couple of years, that's really going to support us. So I would just lay it out to them in a very logical way of just saying, you can have us for the next year, but we're going to spend these next 12 months reviewing other alternatives. And then we're going to take that time to then leave. And so it's either like be a good partner and one that we can invest in, or you're going to lose us.
Yeah. And I guess a big part of it as well is knowing how competitive you really are. So I'm thinking about data, so for example, the work that you do, you get to see across many different clients what their contract looks like for a particular provider. So you've got a really good idea of, well, actually the cost increases that's being requested is actually bringing them up to market, or are you in a situation where you're really overpaying by 25% and they're just trying to see what they can get more? And, knowing that helps inform, okay, this is fair as much as I don't like it, versus I feel like they're taking advantage of us and probably gouging us a little bit on the price. And so therefore, I need to really be looking at what my alternatives are.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a good way to put it. It's, yes, this might be kind of over the budget you have set for this, but it is fair pricing for this supplier and for this industry. And so then it's okay to pull budget from other negotiations or projects because you feel confident that you're getting the best pricing.
Yeah. I'm going to just add into one more question. We're going to come back to some questions as time allows at the end. And then Kelly, I'm going to hand over the floor for you for some questions. But let's see, as I look at some of the questions, there's a question here in regard to the pricing topic. And I think this is from Alfonso. I've noticed consolidation in companies that are going private, meaning that they're buying companies and meaning that buying companies are forced to take the price hit or are continuing to invest more in a vendor, as it's gone private equity companies increasing pricing. Is competition really the only countermeasure? So what we talked about there before of creating a competitive market, creating some competitive tension where you may go somewhere else as being the way to mitigate against if companies are taking private and then increasing their prices.
Yeah. I do think competition is always the strongest lever because nobody wants to lose a set customer. It just costs so much more money to bring in new business. But you can also loop in, like I said, your finance leader and have them discuss directly and just kind of put all the cards on the table in a very smart way. You can cite growth or reduction in kind of your changed focus items. The internal story is typically the most impactful after competition. So, you have multi-year, you have growth. Those are beautiful ones. Those are very difficult right now for companies to allocate that much budget for 2 years. And so if you do have a really specific story that you can share with them, hopefully that will move the needle. It is challenging when they move more private because those rules change, but they still want to keep your business. And so you still have power in the relationship.
Yeah. They don't want to buy a company and then lose all the clients.
Exactly. That looks terrible.
Yeah, I do have one other question before sorry to jump in with one more, Kelly. It came in from Ahmed. Ahmed asks, you mentioned that 5 to 7% annual increase is considered fair or at least standard right now. Do you feel there's no need for negotiation, beyond that? So I'm thinking it means if you get that request, do you kind of just take it and move on? Or is there still room for negotiation around those cost increases?
There's always room for negotiation, especially if it's a new purchase, fight for 3% written in the contract. Yeah. If it's a renewal, fight for that 5%, not 5 to 7%. So there's always room for negotiation. And if you have some other things to sweeten the deal, then cite those and make all the requests you want. I mean, the worst that they can do is say no, but at least you're making a solid case to really improve this contract and your spend as much as possible.
All right. And I can't help myself with a follow-up.
I'm just going to go get lunch, right?
It's like pausing and pausing and pausing and pausing. Just I'm about to go and bring Kelly in. But what is the average contract length that you see? You talked about putting a 3%, year on year, capping the increase, for example, at 3% year on year. What are you typically seeing? 1 year, 2 year, 3 year deals longer than that? I'd love to know if there's a standard right now.
Single year, for sure. We were seeing a lot of 3-year deals in 2021, and now it's single year, unless it's something like Salesforce or Google, and that's like 5-year or 3-year. So
something you build your entire infrastructure of the business around.
Exactly, and you're like, we can't lose this. We just want to sign and not think about it. So that's very rare. If it's a big entity, yes, but for the most part, it's single year contracts.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. I promise, hand it over to you now, even though I see more questions coming in.
Well, the good news is that gave me time to think. And before we start talking about business outcomes, there's actually something I want to ask you, Logan, that I feel like is almost like an elephant in the room with this particular category of spend. So when I think about some of the questions that have come in and some of the ones we plan to ask in advance, I'm wondering how it plays into this, that unlike a product or a material or an assembly where we can say it's blue and it's 5 inches and it weighs this much and it's made of X mixture of materials, or with services where we specify a skill level and we understand that's going to drive an hourly cost from a wage standpoint plus some kind of a markup. I feel like there's almost a dance going on with IT where there's certainly the perception that suppliers are being creative in terms of how they come back with these increases. But you also mentioned the example, and I'm not calling anybody out, but we know it's happening, where there are 20 licenses being used while 10 are being paid for, and we're worried about sort of losing that advantage. So there's some play going on both sides simply because digital technology is so much less easy to capture than some of the other things procurement buys. Based on your perspective on the sales side and the procurement side, is that part of the dynamic that's playing in here where everybody is sort of glaring at each other across the table? You're trying to get one over on me. What is truly driving your costs? Because it's simply such a different category of product. How does that actually come in here and make some of these dynamics we've talked about so unique?
I love this question. Well, it's so unique. And I think especially at the beginning of really technology, like the SaaS world, you really could pull a number out of thin air. But now a lot of companies are speaking with one another. They are understanding what is a normal range for some of these top suppliers. And so you can tell if you are getting really false pricing and they're trying to take advantage of you. And, that's where I come in too, is just to make sure that you're getting fair pricing and that we're fighting for fair pricing. But it is unique because especially right now with all of the increases, your finance team needs to see the justification on why you're going to allocate your budget for this instead of another project. And so Yeah, it's unique because you're like you said, there's no good, there's no service. But I do think that the longer we have this SaaS world going on, the more
Yeah.
comparables we can benchmark against. And that is like, that's a lot of confidence you can build in that relationship. So you don't feel like you're being taken advantage of.
Yeah. And so when you talk about benchmarking, even if procurement and the business together make the decision not to actually go to a competitive bid situation, should we be looking at external benchmarks that we can find just to give us a sense of how does our current pricing compare, or how does an increase compare to other things that are going on? Should we be sort of looking out generally and trying to do our own external benchmarking exercise before we make the decision about what to do with the contract?
Always. I would always take that time to review competitors, their pricing breakdowns, talking to other teams, what are they seeing? And then giving that opportunity to the supplier to understand why their pricing is, what it is. So let's say you see 20,000 as the norm for another competitor and this contract is 50,000. You can bring that to them and say, what are you providing that they're not providing? These are our goals. And you can ask them to justify it while you're talking to this competitor to see if they're able to support your goals. So I'm clearly very big on transparency, but I do think that long term really supports your team so much more than anything else. And so I would always look at alternatives just to see what that pricing looks like. And maybe you're getting more value, and so it's worth that extra money, but you just want to feel confident with that.
Yeah. Now, to that point on transparency, we've sort of thought so far about procurement versus representatives from SaaS providers. As we expand that circle and we start to think about bringing in IT as a stakeholder, maybe bringing in some kind of other business owner that's not in IT as a stakeholder, do they tend to buy into this idea that transparency and conversations is the way to go? Or does that complicate the situation because they have either a different perspective about the provider or maybe even ulterior motives in terms of the business impact they're trying to drive?
A lot of times it muddies it because there's too many chefs in the kitchen, and so many people who are not in finance don't even know what the budget should look like, how it's going to impact bigger picture projects. So it is difficult to bring in more voices. So I do think it's important to do it in almost like a separate way, so you can really bring those stakeholders in to understand the usage of the solution and like what they need from it. And then you can keep them out of the conversation around commercials just to make sure that they are not promising yes to something that there is actually not budget for. I've had that happen many times. And then you have to remind the supplier that they don't make the final decision, the CFO does. So it's just better to kind of keep them out of that commercial conversation if possible.
Yeah. Now, I appreciated your earlier comment about it being part of a supplier's job to provide data. So it's not a loss of leverage on procurement's part. It doesn't make it look like we don't know what's going on. We're saying simply, give us a report, right? Give us the data that we need to make a decision. But I imagine that's also something of a trust but verify kind of scenario.
Of course. Yes.
What
Definitely.
sorts of data should procurement or other parts of the business be tracking internally so that when we get that report, that data back from the supplier, we don't just have to look at it and say, I don't know, like, how do I feel about this? Is it what I expected? Is it what I was thinking I was going to see? What should we be planning ahead of time to have available as an asset to compare that provider report to?
Yeah. I know this would be difficult for some of the bigger companies, but I would highly recommend understanding use case of each solution. And so that also ties in with the unused licenses and the duplicative SaaS solutions. So if you can really understand what's being used and by what teams, and have just some spreadsheets going on of like who is actually invested in each solution, then you might not have the specific numbers, but you have a really strong range for each one. And then you can also find some solutions that aren't being used at all or are overlapping. So I think it's worth the time, and it is, time intensive to go through all your solutions and speak to your team members and, have a good understanding, but you can delegate, you can have managers handle those specifics. but it is so worthwhile for saving budget, preparing for success, especially right now. That's needed more than ever.
And I imagine this is one of those areas where we come back to common data challenges. People tend to focus on what it's easiest to measure. So while you might look at utilization and say, oh, we had 20 licenses and all of those 20 licenses are being used, the next step really is to say, are those 20 licenses driving whatever other specific business impact we brought that piece of technology in-house to do? Is that a hard conversation for teams to have internally to figure out, okay, we know utilization is good, but is it working? Is it doing what we brought it in to do? Do we need to revisit or alter our processes, our focus to get the business ROI we were looking for? How easy or difficult is that step beyond utilization for procurement to get to?
It's very difficult because people don't like change. So they're comfortable with having access to this tool. You typically have a couple people who are cheerleading for it and they love it. They use it at a different company. And then you have this other tool that basically does the same thing and more people are using that. But yeah, it's a very difficult conversation to have, but it's one that's very necessary. And it just takes a really persistent team to get those answers and then to make decisions. And ultimately, I think we'd all rather have a job than have this solution that we're not really using, but we're comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I saw a question just came in from Ahmed that kind of plays to this idea of utilization. I'm basically assuming relatively consistent utilization. But if you have a piece of software where that usage from year to year is going to vary, maybe driven by where the business's focus is, or even seasonality could drive utilization, should that change the way you approach the relationship with the provider and the contract? Or is it still okay to sort of look at the term of the contract and how much access you need to have and drive it based on that instead?
I would suggest understanding that future usage. So like you said, really, if it's going to vary, really understanding why it's going to vary. And then if it's something where you're going to have 200 users one year and 100 the next year, I would just be as clear as possible with the supplier or have language in the contract that protects you with unit cost if you're going to drop to 100, knowing that you're going to then go back up to 250 the next year. So I would find a way to include language that protects your unit cost if you're going to go up and down. Or if you wanted to sign a multi-year, have that specified where it's the 200 then 100. So you're not paying for unused licenses if you're going in knowing that. A lot of companies, I don't think, know that beyond the year. So it's not something I really see often, but I have seen it before. And I think it all comes down to that language that you include in the contract so that if you get a new sales rep, if something happens with the supplier and there are internal changes, you're still protected even with these changes in numbers.
Yeah. Phil, if I can pull you in for a second, one of the things what Logan was just sharing actually makes me think is that, we talk all the time about differentiated decision-making.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful questions I think anybody can ask, and we even internally talk about this all the time, is how do you plan to measure success?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if we think about procurement trying to motivate, drive support, differentiated decision-making, and maybe that question about measuring success around SaaS contracts being the issue that's on the table. For procurement to have a meaningful conversation with the business around this, is this a situation where we're trying to get them to put into words something they already know? Are we going to be in a situation where we're challenging them to figure out how they're planning on managing a successful ROI associated with the contract? How can we do a better job around that differentiated decision-making, not just by providing information, but by asking well-positioned sort of challenge questions to the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to know ultimately how are they measuring success? How is what the software that they are buying contributing to whatever it is that they as a stakeholder, they as an organization, as a budget holder are actually doing, which drives, again, it's kind of cliched words of competitive advantage, but you want to know what's the business impact that the software that they're using is going to drive, because, at the end of the day, it may be that it's, that it's being used as part of a new product, or, understanding a specific customer market segment, or, in R&D or whatever it is, where the costs are relative, arguing over a 5%, 7% cost increase is relatively immaterial, and actually takes up more of their time in even thinking about responding to you to say no, than what the benefit of them is in engaging that, because of what the ultimate impact of the work that they're doing is. So I think unless what is the true reason why this software is needed, and how does that align with how they're creating a difference, you need to know that before you can even start to have a conversation, because then you can make sure the conversation is based on their terms and what's important to them versus what might be important to us as procurement. And so from that point, if you can think about the outcome that they're trying to drive, then you can work backwards from the outcome and think about, well, what's other ways that they can achieve those outcomes? And is there other software out there, or is there other things that we're already using over here that have 95% of the features that will actually do what you're trying to do? And then you can have a conversation kind of based on that, but it makes sure that you have the same end goal. I think so many times there's such a conflict between what procurement's goal is and what the stakeholders' goal is, that's where, stakeholders look at us and say, well, I want to keep you as far away from my supplier as I possibly can, because I don't want to damage the relationship. Because I don't really care about another 3 or 5%, and I'm the budget holder, so it's on me. I'm happy to pay that if it means that I have what in my mind is a healthy relationship with a supplier, because so many stakeholders are uncomfortable with the idea of going and pushing back on pricing, and think that that's going to mean that they're going to somehow damage the relationship. And that's why they often keep us at arm's length, I think, from some of these agreements.
Well, I think it's an interesting way to think differently about procurement's opportunity for impact in this category. So, Logan, Phil just kind of shared a few different examples. Is it about efficiency? Is it about a new product rollout? I can easily envision a situation where procurement sits down and says, okay, business, we've picked this category of software, and we think we know it's going to make something better. Let's be specific about how we plan to manage success. I'm imagining like a blank stare and that little cricket sound in the background, that when you bring it down to a metric or a KPI, it's much harder to answer that question. And so even being able to do what Phil did, where he said, okay, so for instance, are you focused on this? Are you focused on that? Do you find that there are some typical business outcomes that are often associated with common SaaS software, where procurement could say, is it about process efficiency? Is it about, data this? Can you give me a few examples? Or is it really that it's so closely intertwined with the type of software that it's difficult to even give the business general examples to sort of prime the conversation?
Both. So there are so many different types. So, I would never be able to cite all of them. But as you mentioned, efficiency, the creative, as your teams are building out a new initiative, you need tools that are going to help you organize those thoughts and communicate. Communication in general is enormous, making sure that nothing slips through the cracks. Let's see. If you have like a ton of initiatives, like prioritizing them and having like a system that's going to help you keep that in check. Or if you're working with a lot of customers, making sure that data collection is, honest, accurate, updated across all teams. So I would say the biggest ones are efficiency, development, and communication. I feel like that touches every single company, but there are so many nuanced ones, of course.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity then for procurement to even push the business further? So if we start to get to it, can we think, okay, good first pass, but especially if it's a provider where there's an opportunity to collaborate, potentially get involved in a user group or get involved in some type of product design. Do we also have the opportunity, if we've done our homework and the business case is clear, to push further and say, okay, then let's think even beyond how we would measure the success of this contract. How do we want the business to look differently in a year? Or what internal processes can we track above and beyond what the provider delivers to help us really maximize the opportunity associated with the investment in this category of software?
Yeah, and I think even the next step of that is utilizing that partnership for your commercial benefit. So if you're going to be able to, guinea pig on a new rollout, then have that included in the contract, and that's particular discount. Or if you're doing a case study or a video testimonial, any of those things where you're really investing in their success as well, you can utilize that for your commercial benefit. But yeah, I think it's huge to find those kind of partnerships where you can see long-term growth. And I mean, isn't that the ideal format, to invest in something that's really investing in your future success? I mean, that's the holy grail in this world. So yeah, that would be ideal if that happened more often.
Yeah. And we've focused largely on cost in terms of the contract, but are there ways that procurement can incentivize or ensure provider performance? So whether it's simply making sure we get what you've promised us out of this contract, or whether it's making sure that some of those next level things are achieved, are there category specific terms and conditions that we should think about including in a contract to make sure that above and beyond the utilization and the adoption and the implementation that we probably have more responsibility for, that same sort of experience-based or service level investment is being made on the supplier side that wouldn't necessarily apply to a material product or service type contract?
Yeah, there are different metrics to be measured, just depending on what the solution is providing. But I have seen quite a few, especially this past year, where that is clearly written out under special terms of, if these metrics aren't met, then we have the opportunity to exit the contract, even if it's before the end of the term. And you just have to give 5 days notice. So it's very clear that the supplier has to own up to what they're promising, but that does depend on what they're providing. There are some that are there's not an easy way to measure that. It's more like the consumer has to kind of step up and use it. So it really just depends on what they're actually providing.
Yeah. Now, there was one additional question looking back here that I wanted to call out and ask. And then, Phil, maybe we use the remaining time to sort of go through some of our follow-ups and hit the other questions. But I like John's question about changing the rules around single vendor negotiations. So whether there's a very unique solution that you're evaluating and there really isn't a way to do sort of a competitive bid around it, or whether you do have somebody in-house already and you're trying to make sure you have the best deal you can possibly get, but you're not going to switch. And so you're trying to not just bring other people in to be bid fodder. Do you have any advice around making the most of the situation while maybe creatively introducing leverage, where we don't necessarily have other providers to force them all to crash their heads together and force them to compete? Can we switch things up and still do a good job when it's just one provider?
Well, some of the most organic competition is keeping it in-house. So if this is net new, especially, it's a change. And so it's something that hasn't been budgeted for. It's brand new to the organization, and you guys have survived without it thus far. And so you can always utilize internal, systems. So even if it's Excel or if it's,
Oh, everybody would love that. We've
Right.
decided to give up all the software. We're just going to use Excel for everything. That'd be everybody's best day.
And that's how it used to be. It's just
Yeah.
so much more time consuming. And so we have these great tools that really drive success, but some of them aren't necessary. I mean, they're really nice to have, almost a must have, but you can still get away another year with keeping it in-house. So I think that's some really strong and natural leverage you can utilize. I would also just, if they're new to the space, they're going to need, as we just discussed, they're going to need advocates for their solution. So you can negotiate a really good partnership where you're testing out new things for them. You are a voice for their solution. And that can be instead of competition, that can be the leverage utilize. Or just, I think that those are the top ones. I'm trying to think, beyond the typical ones, like what really speaks to a brand new type of product. And I would say case study or being an advocate. And then the alternative is just keeping it in-house with no spend.
Yeah. All right, Phil, let me hand back to you then, because you've probably had a better chance to take a look at some of the questions that we've been coming in.
I've been reading down all the questions and making some notes on them, and it's great to see so much engagement and posing so many great questions, really. I did actually want to follow up on the question that you asked that John posed about changing the rules in a single vendor negotiation, because I wanted to expand that a little bit to be, how about when it's a new, it's a startup essentially. It's a software company that is perhaps doing something that's innovative. There isn't really a market for it, but you want to bring them. There's been no real price benchmarking from the market to say this is what the value of this is. And on their side, they're probably they don't know either. So they're trying to just get away with whatever they can get away with. Any advice on how you enter into negotiations where, there's not necessarily a formed marketplace, there's a new provider is providing something that's new and innovative, about how you go? And I don't want to say it's not about being taken advantage of or taking advantage of the party. It's about how do we negotiate in a way that sets that up for success?
Yeah. And that is a conversation to have often, because there are so many brand new companies just popping out. There's no information on them. They were just developed. And for a new purchase, a new investment, I always suggest anchoring around 40% off. And that's a huge discount. I recognize that. But this is brand new spend for the finance team. And this is that supplier's opportunity to win your business and win it long term. So I highly recommend going as steep as you can with the discounts to start, because you're having to trust and gamble that this is going to really benefit you. And so you don't want to just throw all your money at it and then it fail. So I would slowly, slip into that relationship and allow them to win you over. And then, obviously they're going to do cost increases every year unless you really are firm and put that in the contract. But 40% is typically the anchor I would suggest.
And how unusual or usual would it be to, let's say you start at -40 and then you're kind of going up and you're ultimately grandfathering back into market pricing, but it takes 3 years to do so. So it may be 15% year-on-year increases for 3 years to get you back to kind of where market is. And then at that point, you're more kind of along the lines of parity. Do you see that? Or do you see that, once you've kind of negotiated that -40%, that's the new baseline? And so everything is kind of on that -40. And so you may always kind of enjoy that gap between what their market prices are and what you were able to negotiate, because essentially you're one of the first people to take a risk on them as a provider.
Oh yeah, that -40 is the benchmark. And there are so many customers who never question pricing and will sign whatever is offered initially. And so they're making their money on those contracts, but you don't want to be that contract. You want to question it. You want to understand why. You want to make sure you are at the floor of what they can allow. So I would always push back. Even if it's a flat renewal, I would push back just to see what you can maneuver from
How
it.
they respond.
Yeah. Yeah. And they might say no. They'll probably say no, but that's worth it.
Yeah.
Ahmed asked a question around support. So if you have to deal with a software support contract, your usage of that support varies from year to year. Is it best to do that to have a support contract, or to have something that's more time and material, where it's kind of pay on use? Or does even everyone offer that, from a maintenance perspective?
Not everyone offers that. It's typically a support tier at this point. So it's a blanket number. But if you are going to need a ton of hours, here's what I would suggest. If it's project specific, I would do a statement of work and get those hours allocated so that you have it organized and it's for that project. If it's for the annual experience, I would do a support tier so that you can call on them whenever needed and you have that representative that can support you come what may. So project specific SOW, typically a tier.
Okay. And a comment from Stephen, just ask, best advice I've ever received. So just ask and see what you can get sometimes is definitely the way forward.
And it won't damage the partnership.
No.
They are expecting it and they would do the same. They're in sales. So it will not damage your relationship. They probably will respect that you asked.
Yeah. We have a question around if there is if going through a VAR, a value-added reseller, can often be the best approach versus more direct channels if it's cheaper. And perhaps that's the case if there's a way that we can measure the reseller's markup and the value that they bring to a deal. Now, do you see purchases sometimes going through a reseller?
Oh, all the time. We have, it just depends on the supplier, but we have lots of resellers kind of attached to each one, and then some that blanket. But a really good way to utilize competition is other resellers or direct. Sometimes you can cut through and, you know, get some deeper discounts going direct. And then other times there's more value adds with the VAR. So yeah, you just need, it's the same kind of benchmarking. You just need to look at the total contract. I know they're broken out differently per reseller, but there shouldn't be that much markup. I mean, they're providing value, but like it's not that great of value. So they should keep it pretty consistent to direct pricing.
And at the end of the day, it's the total cost that matters the most to you.
Yes.
You know, regardless of if they have a markup, but you're still getting a lower total cost, then that's really the most important thing for you as a buyer, I would suggest.
Totally. And I have some customers who they'll use a reseller for 10 of the contracts. So there's value in that they just keep it all organized. It's under one umbrella. And so there's a bit of a markup, but they're aware of it. I think if you're aware of what the markup is, you feel a lot more comfortable.
Yeah,
but if
you're not being taken advantage of.
Right. If they try to sneak it in, it feels gross.
So we have one more question I want to ask that came in earlier from John, which is around any best practices for using software asset management for challenging the IT providers.
Can we dig into that more? So yeah,
so I'm thinking that may be actually related more to maybe it's related more to hardware than software. But John, if you are still around and want to just pop in a follow-up, then I can pose that to Logan. I'll ask another one just if as we wait, John, if you want to pop any more context in around that question. I had one around end of quarter negotiations, you know, where you definitely see, even we as a small business see the software providers we work with certainly getting more aggressive when it comes to end of quarter negotiation. Now, is that something that is still prevalent, more prevalent, less prevalent? Where the best deals are end of quarter? Is it something that's more myth than reality? You know, how do you kind of plan around end of quarter when it comes to negotiations?
I feel like it's half and half. So you have some, and I like to ask the supplier immediately. I say, what are your incentives? Do you have timing? Do you have growth? Do you have multi-year? Like, what are you rewarded for? And I think it's good to know that so that you can then take that to your, you know, leadership and say, these are what is going to drive it for them. We can still make a case for anything that you need, but you know, if you want a 5% extra discount, you need to sign by end of month or end of quarter. So I think it's half and half end of quarter. End of year is a really strong one. You just have to know what end of year is per supplier. So, you know, you can't always use end of calendar year.
I know what the fiscal year is.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. But yeah, I mean, timing is always an important one. People want to hit their quota. And so just understanding like what's driving their success and then supporting it if possible.
And so so is it fair that it's mostly that they're just willing, as a salesperson, they're willing to give up most of what they're allowed to give up, you know, end of quarter, because maybe they've got goals based around revenue. And so it may be an individual salesperson to salesperson conversation as well, as opposed to one company policy versus another company policy.
Totally. That's as we talked about relationships, that's where that also comes into play, where they need that one additional sale to hit that number and go on the, you know, President's Club trip. So if they can make that happen, you know, you can get a good deal. But, you know, I wish that happened more, but when it does happen, it's real sweet.
And the follow-up from John around software asset management was using software asset management to measure licenses that are currently consumed.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you have like a very efficient way to do so, go for it, because that's going to just allow you a real-time snapshot of what's being utilized. And then if you're starting to see the trend go down, then you can start to talk about getting rid of that solution, or maybe finding something else or just reducing the license count if it's going down a good bit. So yeah, I think that's brilliant to use that type of system.
All right. Well, I know it's about time to wrap up. So first of all, Kelly, thanks for joining me today and for helping me in firing all the questions off. So
Absolutely.
Logan, and putting Logan on the spot for the last 55 minutes. Logan, you did a great job. Thank you so much for joining us. Lots of great insights and real-time kind of information that you're seeing from all the negotiations that you're working on right here at the beginning of 2024. So truly appreciate your time and the value of your experience.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me. This was a treat. And it was just, it was great to use the knowledge that I've gained these last couple of years and get to share it. So thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you. And just finally to say, the value of some of these sessions is always based upon the level of engagement as well that we get from our community. We had lots of great questions that made Kelly and I's job a lot easier today. So I want to thank you as well for asking the questions, firing them away to Logan, and had a really good session. So with that all said, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will speak to you all again soon.